Welcome in or welcome back. Today we're going to be continuing to read from the Eclipse Chronicle, the August Reckoning, a mythological epic in 5 paths, covering the astrological placements from July 20th to July 29th, and then fast forwarding to August 12th, where there's the total solar eclipse. This is apparently the rarest, or maybe one of the rarest, configurations. According to astrologers, they have never been able to find this in history, going back thousands of years. It's called the Barbault basket, named after the astrologer Andres Barbault, who's apparently discovered it, or as some others like to call it, the Great Alignment or whatever. Okay. All right, so we left off on part 3, and we're on part 4 of part 3. All right, so Fren, the tasks. The first task had come at a ruined temple on the second day of walking, a small sanctuary, roofless now, open to the sky, with an altar stone that weather and time had reduced to something elemental. Just a flat surface of a very old rock with the faint impression of carved figures that were no longer distinguishable as figures, just the memory of figures, the idea of them in the stone. Fren had sat down in the grass beside the altar as the evening came on, because the map indicated this location and the feeling in their body agreed. This was where the first task lived. The task of memory required them to name aloud every person they had wronged in this life. Not every person who had wronged them. That was a different list and a more comfortable one. And Hades' ledger was not interested in comfort. Every person they had wronged, by commission or omission, by neglect or impatience, or cowardice, or the casual cruelty of assuming that because someone had not visibly broken, they were not broken. It took all night. They had not expected it to take all night. They had brought their journal and wrote each name as they spoke it. And the list was longer than they had known. Not because they were a particularly terrible person. They weren't. They were an ordinarily imperfect one. But because they had been careful over the years not to look at this list, and the avoidance had allowed it to grow without their full knowledge. The way debts grow when you don't open the statements. By the time the sky began to lighten and they had spoken the last name, they were exhausted in a way that went past the body into something older. They sat beside the altar in the pink-gray dawn, and they felt the weight of the ledger in a new way, not as shame, which was how they'd feared they would feel, but as proportion. This is what I carry. Not more than this, not less, exactly this much. The second task had been the descent into the cave at the base of the Antares side mountain on the morning of the 23rd. The cave was not deep. They were perhaps 30 meters in before the light from the entrance behind them became inadequate. But depth is not a function of distance. They sat in the cave and watched the darkness ahead of them and waited for what the darkness contained. It came as a reflection that had no mirror, themselves older, wearing chains so old they had become part of the body, embedded in the flesh, with the comfortable, terrible domesticity of things that had been carried so long they no longer feel like cargo. The reflection didn't speak at first. It sat across from Saren in the dark, and it looked at them with eyes that knew everything they had managed not to know. When it finally spoke, it said one word, not a sentence, not an explanation, just the word spoken the way a diagnosis is spoken, not to judge, but to name with precision what has been vague: guilt. Not guilt for anything specific in this life, guilt as a constitutional state, a belief ancient as bone that they deserved the weight. That the weight was penance, that the penance was for something so vast and original that they could not remember its source, only its gravity. The guilt that is older than any act. The guilt of existing in a way that someone, somewhere, at some point, had decided was excessive, and that Saren had, and the most private architecture of their soul, agreed with. They sat with the reflection for 3 hours. At the end, the reflection said, "You did not make the wall, but you have been maintaining it. That is the part that belongs to you." The reflection dissolved. Saren walked back toward light. Outside the cave, Mars was rising in the east, red and urgent. The war god who drives forward when all the body says stop. And they gathered their pack and they walked. The third task, the task of fire, came on the road on the 24th. A stranger, sudden and furious, stepped from behind a boulder to block the path, and declaring, with the bizarre specificity of someone transmitting a message from a source they don't understand, that Saren had destroyed something precious. Not in this life, in another incarnation, the stranger seemed to be channeling. The accusation was real. Saren could feel it was real in the way they felt all the old things, in the body, in the place below the sternum where consequence lives. They did not fight. They did not flee. They stood in the road with the Mars heat in their blood, and they absorbed the accusation, and they said, "I believe you. I don't remember it, but I believe you, and I am here. I am walking toward the place where I can give it back. That is all I have to offer." The stranger stood in the road and looked at them for a very long time, then, without another word, stepped aside. Saren walked on. The sun was very hot. Antares blazed in the south like a warning or an invitation. The heart of the scorpion, the star of everything that must die before it can become what it truly is. Part 5, Zephyr, the Underground and the Meeting. The old port tunnels smelled of salt water and stone, and the kind of darkness that has been undisturbed long enough to develop its own character. Zephyr moved through them with a small lamp, one of Agatha's, A clever thing that used an oil she mixed herself and that produced very little smoke. And the encrypted notebook in which the manifesto was slowly becoming something they were not ashamed of. They had been in the tunnels for perhaps 4 hours when they heard the fire. Not a roar, a particular sound, specific and contained. The sound of a fire that is doing exactly what it has been set to do, and no more. They moved toward the sound, which was probably against reasonable judgment, but Uranus had never been much for reasonable judgment, and Zephyr was built from similar material. The fire was at a junction in the tunnels, a place where 3 passages met in a vaulted chamber with a cracked ceiling through which improbably a shaft of evening light descended. The fire was in a small stone bowl. Beside the fire, cross-legged on the tunnel floor, was a woman with iron gray hair and mud on her boots, writing something in a journal with the focused calm of someone who had just done something large and is now processing it. She looked up when Zephyr appeared in the lamplight. She did not seem surprised. The tunnels, Zephyr said, for want of anything more intelligent, are more populated than I expected. The tunnels are older than anyone who's trying to own the land above them, Morgan said. Old things tend to hold everyone equally. She gestured at the floor across the fire. Sit. They sat. They told each other the minimum necessary to explain what they were doing in an underground junction in the dark, which turned out to be more than either of them expected. Zephyr talked about the transmission and the counterwave and the manifesto. Morgan talked about the square and the cauldron and the 3 women and the difference between the blade and the root. What you did, Zephyr said slowly, in the square, the naming, that's what I'm trying to do at scale with the documents. The naming of what has been done and who has done it. The difference, Morgan said, is that I had to be present for it. I could not send the naming through a network. I had to stand in the square myself and speak it with my own voice, and they had to see my face while I said it. The presence is part of how it works. She paused. Is your manifesto, are you in it? Is your voice in it, not just your arguments? Zephyr was quiet for a long time. I've been keeping myself out of it deliberately, they said finally. Security reasons, operational ones. Security reasons, Morgan said, with the tone of someone who recognizes the word for what it sometimes is. Or the other kind of reasons. The kind that look like strategy and feel like fear. The fire crackled between them. In the shaft of light from the ceiling, a single bat moved through and disappeared. Morgan reached into her coat and brought out a small glass vial. Dark glass with something inside that caught the firelight in a way that didn't entirely correspond to the fire's position. This is made from roots and specific marsh water, an intention I set 3 weeks ago, she said. I don't know what it will do for you. I only know what it has done for others. It's the medicine of what has been buried. She held it out across the fire for what it's worth. Zephyr took it. What do I do with it? You'll know, Morgan said, when the moment arrives. They parted an hour later, each continuing their direction. Morgan back toward the marsh, Zephyr toward the end of the tunnel that smelled of the sea, and the boat that would be waiting there, and the open water between the ports and the Eclipse site, and the manifesto that was still incomplete, but that was, Zephyr now understood, incomplete in a specific way that they knew how to address. Part 4, The Convergence, July 29th through August 11th. Part 1 of Part 4, The Shadow Crosses. Far above the Mediterranean basin, above the curvature of the living earth, where weather and ambition and the small enormous dramas of human days were in progress, the moon continued its ancient orbit. It had been doing this for a very long time. Long before the first king had named himself beloved of heaven. Long before the first oracle had opened her throat to the voice of the dead. Long before the first exile had set foot on the road that had no return. The moon was not indifferent to these activities. The moon, in the oldest mythological understanding, was their timekeeper. Their tide, their regulating force, the body that pulled at the waters of the earth and the waters of the blood, and the same gravitational law, the same patient insistence. On the 29th of July, the moon's shadow began its approach toward the geometry that would produce, on the 12th of August, the total eclipse. This approach was imperceptible to the naked eye. The moon was not yet positioned to block the sun, was weeks away from that alignment, but in the bodies of those whose nervous systems were tuned to the deeper frequencies, it was felt. Not as darkness, not yet. As a slight alteration in pressure. The feeling of something very large moving very slowly in a direction that was not yet identified, but was unmistakably purposeful. Callista felt it first because she was always first. She was 10 days into her journey back toward the volcanic island, and she stopped on the road mid-morning and put her hand against a stone wall and stayed very still for a moment while the voices reorganized themselves around a new signal. Not historical, not the voices of the dead, but something anticipatory and vast. She said aloud, "The shadow had begun to move." A passing shepherd's boy looked at her oddly. She smiled at him and continued walking. Saren felt it in her body, in their feet. A change in the quality of the earth beneath them, as though the ground they were walking on had become almost imperceptibly weighted. Not heavier, more significant. They had crossed the highland plateau by now and were approaching the axis plane between the two mountains, and the feeling intensified with each southward mile. Antares was enormous now in the southern sky at night. It had been rising earlier and earlier, and its red light was becoming something they organized their nights around, the way a sailor organizes navigation around a fixed star. Lysander had called his council, the assembly of delegates, including, for the first time, the representatives from the eastern provinces, who arrived with a particular wariness of people who have been invited into a room for the first time and have not yet determined whether it's an invitation or a trap. Was scheduled for the 8th of August. He had 4 days until then, and he was using them in a way he had never used them before. Reading. Not correspondence, not reports, not the documents of governance. He was reading history. The kind he had always known existed and had never examined directly. His grandmother's people's history, what they had built before his grandfather had decided to build over it, who they had been. Zephyr was on the water. The boat was small and not particularly comfortable, but the sea was cooperating with an unusual flatness for early August, and they sat in the bow with the encrypted notebook and the manifesto, and they wrote. Since the tunnel conversation with Morrigan, something had shifted in the manifesto's architecture. A new chamber had opened in it, one that was personal, one that contained Zephyr's own voice rather than just their arguments. And the writing moved through this chamber with the speed of something that had been waiting a long time for the door to open. They thought about what Morrigan had said about presence, about the voice that the face must be present for. They thought about the vial in their coat pocket. They thought about the eclipse date, the 12th. Toward which they were sailing, and they thought, the manifesto needs to go out in my own voice at the moment of totality. Not in the abstract, not through the anonymous network, in my own voice, my name on it. Prometheus Unchained doesn't get to hide behind a mask while he's unchaining. This thought both terrified and clarified them, which is how you know it's the right one. Morgan had returned to the marsh. The village was in the complicated process it had been in ever since the square. Not resolved, nothing like resolved. There were meetings and arguments and tears and the occasional house where the lights burned until very late. And she was not its center. She had done her part of it. The village would have to do the rest of itself. She was available for those who came to the marsh edge with honest questions, but she was not managing the aftermath. That was not the root's job. The root planted the thing. The community had to grow it or not. What she was doing in the days between the market square and the eclipse was preparing for something she could feel coming the way she had felt the first vision in the black water. A final ritual, a burying. The blade she had refused in the dream, she still had to bury it. The actual blade, the one she had kept for 18 years in the chest under her sleeping mat. The knife she had sharpened 100 times in the dark of the marsh and had never used. She knew where to bury it at the crossroads, at the moment when the moon swallowed the sun. That was the end of the exile. Not the square. The square was the public reckoning. The crossroads burial was the private one. The thing you do for yourself at midnight with no audience. Part 2. Saren, the wall on the plain. The Saturn Hades wall appeared on the 27th, as the map had promised it would. and it was not metaphor. It stretched from horizon to horizon across the highland plateau, or rather, it stretched from the limit of visibility in both directions, which amounted to the same thing. A stone wall, ancient, massive, built of blocks that were too large for any single human endeavor in any era Saren could identify. The mortar between the blocks had become stone itself over the centuries, and the stone surface was covered in lichens that were very old, and the particular amber gray of very old things. The wall was perhaps 4 meters high. Along the top, at intervals, were carved figures that might have been guardians or warnings, or simply the art of people who understood that a wall of this significance required witness. There was a single gate. Iron, massive, hinged on stone posts that descended into the earth at depths Saren did not attempt to measure. The gate was closed, and there was a lock in it, not a keyhole. No slot for a physical key, just the lock itself, which was in the shape of a hand, a carved stone hand, palm outward. The gesture of stop in every tradition that had ever felt the need to codify stopping. Saren stood before the gate for an hour. They walked the visible length of the wall in both directions, looking for another way. There was none, or rather, there may have been another way, but it was not the way the map indicated, and the map's path went through this gate, and the gate required something that Saren did not know yet how to name. They sat down in the dust in front of the gate, and they thought about what the reflection in the cave had said. The guilt that is older than any act. The guilt of existing excessively, of being too much, of taking up space that someone somewhere had once decided was not theirs to take. The belief so deep it was structural, so old it had become the architecture of everything built on top of it, that they deserved to carry what they carried. That the weight was the appropriate condition. That to put it down would be, what, irresponsible? Presumptuous? An act of taking more than their share, this time of lightness, of being unburdened, of freedom. You did not make the wall, the reflection had said, but you have been maintaining it. The maintaining, the daily maintenance, the small acts of returning to the weight when it tried to lift. The way they had over and over in this life chosen interpretations of events that confirmed the heaviness, declined interpretations that might have permitted something lighter. Because the lightness felt more dangerous than the weight. Because the weight, at least, was familiar, and the familiar is always, in the reptile heart, safer than the unknown, regardless of how terrible the familiar is. That's interesting here, the reptile heart. Okay. Alright. What What they carried was not the karmic debt itself. The debt had been walked through, the tasks, the naming, the fire, the descent. What they carried now was the identity built around the carrying. The self that had organized itself so thoroughly around the weight that it didn't know what it would be without it. They sat with this until sunset. The evening star rose. Antares blazed above the southern range of mountains. Aldebaran appeared in the north, answering it across the full width of the sky. The two red stars, the scorpion's heart and the bull's eye, holding the axis between them like a conversation that had been ongoing since before there were words. "You did not come this far to retreat," Saturn whispered, from the leaden place below their sternum. "I know," Saturn said. They stood up, they walked to the gate, they placed their hand against the stone hand, palm to palm. The gesture of both stop and greeting. Hello and goodbye. The gesture that contains both within it. And they said aloud to the gate and the wall and the weight and the 43 lifetimes of accumulated consequence, I surrender the identity, not the history. I keep the history. I need the history. But the identity built around the carrying. The self that requires the weight to know itself, I put that down. The gate opened, not dramatically, no thunder, no grinding stone, no miraculous light. It simply opened, the way things open when they find their mechanism engaged. With a sound like very old iron moving that had been waiting to move for a very long time. Saturn walked through. On the other side, the axis plane between the two mountains stretched in the last light of the evening, and it was beautiful in the specific way that very simple things are beautiful, directly without ornament. Flat highland earth, dry grass, the enormous sky above it. Antares in the south. Aldebaran in the north. The first stars of the scorpion fanning out in one direction. The Pleiades beginning to appear in the other. The air between the two mountains was different from the air on the wall's north side, cooler, cleaner, with the quality of air that had not been breathed yet and is waiting for you specifically. Saturn walked out onto the plain and stopped and stood very still and felt for the first time in this body, in this life, what it was like to not be carrying something. It was disorienting. It was terrifying. It was the most expansive thing they had ever felt. They stood there until the dark was complete and the stars were fully out, and Antares and Aldebaran were overheard, and the Milky Way was the pale river it always was on the clear, high plateau nights. And they thought, I have to get to the Eclipse site, and there will be others there, and something is going to happen that I have been walking toward my entire life, in every life. They set up camp on the plain between the mountains, and they slept without dreaming, which had not happened in 4 years. The sleep of someone who has set something down and found that the earth will hold it. Part 3, Callista, the library burns. The message reached her on the 1st of August, carried by a fisherman who had been given it at the volcanic island's harbor by a boy he didn't know and who had already gone. The library had been struck. Not the state, not any of the institutional interests she had occasionally worried about. Lightning. Actual lightning. A summer storm, brief and localized, and with the specific violence of Uranian weather, had sent a bolt directly through the tunnel entrance and down into the library chambers. Most of the clay tablets were intact, clay being a material that responds to fire by becoming harder, more permanent, which was why ancient civilizations had been sensible enough to use it for their most important records. But the papyri were gone. The transcription copies, her personal journals, all 12 of them, representing 15 years of received prophecy and personal processing, the shelves of secondary materials, the comfortable accumulations of a scholarly life organized around objects that held knowledge so that the scholar's body didn't have to. She sat on a stone wall by the side of the road and held the message and felt the loss move through her, not as grief, though grief was part of it, more as dislocation, as the feeling of a building you have organized your orientation around suddenly not being there and having to learn again where north is without it. And then this took approximately 2 hours as something else, as the recognition of what the lightning had done by destroying the accumulated record. It had made her carry it. She was now the library. 15 years of received transmission, the full text of every voice she had taken in through the Mercury Kronos Hades channel, was now nowhere except inside her body. There was no reference book to reach for. There was no cross-index to check. There was only the accumulated knowing living in her nervous system the way language lives in a native speaker, not as stored information, but as capacity, as a way of moving through the world that is inseparable from the self that moves. This thing, she understood slowly, was what was required for what was coming. The oracle needed to be the oracle, not the archivist. The voice needed to speak without the scaffold of text around it. At the Eclipse site, when all the voices came simultaneously, she would need to be the empty of structure and full. She would need to be empty of structure and full of transmission, a vessel, not a catalog. Ah, she said to the burned library, the destroyed notes, the 15 years of careful organization returned to smoke and hard clay. I see. She stood up, shouldered her pack, lighter now, with no tablets to transcribe into, and continued her journey. The voices inside of her, without the competition of the external archive, were clearer than they had ever been. Every dead king, every seer who had not spoken and not been heard, every prophet who had been punished for their precision, all of them organized in her body like a great cathedral holds music, by the resonance of its architecture, by the design that makes it possible for sound to live inside stone. She realized, no longer afraid of the eclipse. She had been at the level below thought, afraid of the moment when everything she'd been holding would be required simultaneously, afraid of not being adequate to the transmission, afraid of the silence on the other side of it. But the lightning had taken the last thing she'd been planning to hide behind. All she had now was the truth, and the truth did not require her to be afraid of it. It required only her presence and her voice, and the willingness to speak what came through it without editing it into something safer. She arrived at the eclipse site on the 9th of August, 3 days early, and she began to prepare the space. Part 4, the eclipse site. The site was where it had always been, a natural amphitheater in the highland plateau, ringed by low hills that created a bowl of sky above and a stillness of air within. Okay. It would help if I picked up my spot before. Okay. An ancient place, the kind of place that human beings have been using for sacred purposes since before the word sacred existed. Because the land itself creates the quality of attention, and the people who arrive there simply become appropriate to the space. The ground was volcanic in origin, dark with mineral richness, and the grasses that grew there were the pale gold of late summer, highland grass, ankle high, moving in the faint wind that circulated in the bowl, even on the stillest days. Callista walked the circumference of the space on the morning of the 9th and understood what it was built for: convergence. The hills created a bowl that gathered and held. The dark earth amplified. The pale grass moved and stilled in rhythms that aligned. She felt, with the patterns of breath and speech, and the particular biological frequency of large truths being spoken aloud. She made no elaborate preparation. She cleared a small area at the center of the bowl, laid a fire that was ready to be lit. She set a stone on each of the 4 quadrants of the compass. She sat at the center of the space, and she began very quietly to speak. Not to anyone in particular, not to the dead or the living, but in the specific mode of the oracle who is warming the channel, loosening what had been held tight, preparing the body for what it is about to be asked to carry. By the 10th, Saren had arrived. Having walked in the last day's distance from the axis plane with the specific ease of a body that has put down what it has been carrying and is discovering with each mile how different movement feels without it. They saw Callista at the center of the bowl and walked to her without hesitation, which surprised them because they had expected to be shy, to hang back, to need time to adjust. But the sight had its quality of making everything appropriate, and approaching the oracle at the center of the space felt completely correct. "You made it," Callista said. She looked at them with the oracle's eyes, the ones that saw what was present rather than what was presented, And she said, "The wall is gone." "The gate opened," Saren said. "Yes," said Callista, "it does, when you bring the right thing." Zephyr arrived on the 10th as well. Alright, that just made me like hella emotional. I can pull myself together. Okay. Alright. Zephyr arrived on the 10th as well, the boat having made better time than expected, which was the sea's gift. They came over the hill's rim with the encrypted notebook under one arm and the small oil lamp from the tunnel still in their bag, and the unfinished manifesto fully finished in their mind. And they looked down at the bowl and said aloud to no one in particular, "There it is." On the 11th, Lysander came. He had traveled the sea road south and then inland with a small retinue, I don't know how to say it. Not the ceremonial guard, the usual display of power and protection, just Peleus and 2 men whose competence he trusted. He had left the palace in the hands of the council, with instructions that the Eastern provincial representatives were to have equal voices in all deliberations while he was gone. He had left the summer crown on his desk. He was wearing his own clothes, not rags. He had not arrived at theater in the other direction. His own clothes, good ones, the ones that fit his actual body at 61, rather than the ceremonial inflations that made the office visible. He looked for the first time in Peleus's professional memory, like a man rather than an institution. He descended into the bowl and found 3 people there, around a fire that had been lit as the evening came on, and he sat with them in the way that people sit with others when the usual social calculations have, for one reason or another, been suspended, as though they had always known each other. As though the specific configuration of these 4 people in this specific place had been arranged by something larger than any of their individual decisions. They talked through the night, the 4 of them, not about strategy or logistics, about what had happened to each of them in the previous 3 weeks. In the way that people who have been through something describe what they've been through to others who have been through something, not for information, but for the recognition that comes from telling the truth to people who are not going to be frightened by it. Morrigan arrived before dawn on the 12th. She came from the North Road, having walked through the night, and she came into the bowl in the dark and found the fire and the 4 sleeping forms around it, and she sat down with her back against a stone, and she took the knife from her coat pocket, the knife she had carried for 18 years, the knife she had sharpened 100 times in the dark, and she held it in her hands in the last of the night, feeling its weight, its old meaning, its long history as the thing she was going to use for revenge if she ever found the right moment and the right target, and the thing she had never used and would now never use, not because she was incapable, but because she had chosen the other instrument, the root, the medicine of exposure and truth, and the blade had been decommissioned by that choice without ever having been wielded. And I'm going to leave that there, and we will continue in the next one. And to that, I bid you adieu.